What could make a man who has everything, wealth, luxury, and the power to bend the world to his will, burst into tears in front of complete strangers? Imagine this. The lights of New York City glowing against the night sky, traffic crawling along Fifth Avenue, and in the back seat of a sleek black limousine sits Richard, a millionaire whose fortune is written in every detail of his life. His gold watch glimmers under the streetlights, his suit costs more than most people make in a month, and his expression carries the kind of arrogance that only comes from believing money is the answer to every problem. Yet, on this particular evening, as rain patters against the car window, a small hand presses against the glass. It's the hand of a boy no older than 9, his clothes torn, his face pale from hunger, his eyes filled with a quiet desperation. He isn't asking for money, he isn't begging for riches, he's simply whispering for food. And then, something unthinkable happens. Instead of compassion, instead of the smallest gesture of kindness, Richard laughs. A cold, dismissive laugh that cuts through the boy like a knife. Have you ever witnessed a moment so cruel, so raw, that it makes your chest tighten? This is one of those moments. And what you're about to discover now may surprise you, because in just a few seconds, that laugh would vanish, replaced by tears Richard couldn't control. Stay with me until the end, because this isn't just a story about a poor child and a rich man. It's a story about what happens when arrogance collides with innocence, when wealth is confronted by pure need, and when a single encounter has the power to turn a lifetime of beliefs upside down. Picture the scene more closely. The city's rhythm continues around them. Honking horns, glowing billboards, couples leaving expensive restaurants with bags of leftovers they won't even finish at home. Yet there, under the same sky, stands Daniel, a boy whose stomach has been empty for days, whose shoes are worn thin, and whose only hope is the mercy of strangers. He doesn't shout, he doesn't demand. His voice is almost too soft to hear as he pleads for something as basic as bread. Richard, leaning back against fine leather seats, sees only a nuisance. He has spent years convincing himself that poverty is laziness, that those who beg are undeserving. So when Daniel's small hand lingers against the window, Richard smirks and shakes his head, amused by the audacity of this child daring to disturb his world of comfort. He rolls down the window just enough to let his voice carry out, and with a mocking tone, he asks if Daniel really thinks people like him belong anywhere near people like Richard. His friends in the car chuckle along, feeding the millionaire's ego, turning cruelty into entertainment. But here's where the story begins to shift, and you'll want to hear this, because life has a strange way of humbling those who believe they are untouchable. In that very moment, something happens that Richard never expected, something that forces him to see not just a starving boy, but a reflection of something buried deep inside his own past. Have you ever had a moment where reality slaps you so hard it leaves you speechless? That's where Richard was heading. And as we step further into this story, you'll see how the laugh of a millionaire transforms into uncontrollable tears, how a child with nothing gives a man with everything the lesson of his life, and how one rainy night in New York became the turning point he could never forget, because sometimes it isn't money, power, or success that defines us. It's what we do when faced with the fragile humanity of another soul. And what unfolded that night would prove that even the coldest hearts can crack open in the presence of innocence. Now, let's move deeper into the story. And maybe right now, as you picture that rainy night, something inside you stirs too. Because stories like this aren't just about them, they're about us. They remind us of the moments when we looked away, when we judged too quickly, or when we chose silence instead of compassion. Have you ever lived something like that? A situation where you wished you had acted differently, or where someone's coldness left a mark on you? If so, share it with me in the comments. Your words matter, not just to me, but to everyone who gathers here, to reflect and grow together. This space only exists because of people like you, people who feel, who think, who care enough to pause and listen. When you leave a comment, you give life to the conversation. When you click that like button, you help the story reach more eyes, more hearts that might need to hear it today. And when you subscribe, you're not just adding a number. You're telling me and telling yourself that you want to keep walking through these stories, these lessons, these truths that remind us what really matters. So, if this beginning touched something in you, stay close. Leave your footprint in the comments, let the story resonate through your like, and join this community by subscribing so we can keep uncovering together the powerful messages hidden in the most unexpected encounters. Because as you'll see in what comes next, that single night in New York didn't just change the life of a boy named Daniel, it shattered the certainty of a millionaire who thought nothing could move him. And what happened after, well, it's the part that still makes people talk to. This day, stay with me. New York has a way of hiding contradictions in plain sight. On the same avenue where the glow of luxury boutiques promises endless possibilities, a child can stand invisible, pressed against the cold glass of a display window, staring at food he can't touch. That night, the streets were alive with the sound of honking taxis, footsteps on wet pavement, and laughter spilling out from rooftop bars. Neon signs blinked above diners where people casually left half-eaten burgers on their plates, while just outside, the air carried the hollow sound of a boy's stomach growling. The city was, as always, a stage of power and vulnerability, of abundance and emptiness, colliding within a few feet of each other. Richard's limousine rolled slowly along Fifth Avenue, its tinted windows sealing him off from the rest of the world. Inside, the scent of expensive cologne mixed with the leather seats, and a chilled bottle of champagne rested between him and his colleagues. He tilted, his glass grinning, amused by a joke only the wealthy could afford to make. His life was an endless sequence of meetings, deals, and celebrations, each one confirming the belief that he had mastered every decision, that he had control over everything. Outside, however, the rain-slicked streets reflected another truth entirely. Daniel had been walking for hours. His sneakers were torn at the sides, exposing small toes to the puddles below, and his hoodie hung loose, damp from the drizzle. He paused outside a bakery, inhaling deeply as the smell of warm bread escaped through a vent. His eyes followed a man exiting with a bag full of pastries, the man tossing the bag onto the passenger seat of his car, unaware of the boy staring. Hunger does something to the mind. It sharpens it, makes every detail louder, every smell more vivid, every bite of food someone else wastes feel like a silent wound. He whispered to himself, almost as if trying to convince the city to hear him. Just a sandwich, that's all. His voice was too small to compete with the roar of engines, but it was all he had left. As the limousine approached a red light, Daniel stepped forward. He hesitated at first, glancing around to see if anyone was watching, then placed his hand against the cool glass of the car window. From inside, Richard noticed the smudge of tiny fingers before he saw the boy. His eyes narrowed. He lowered the window just enough for his words to pass through, his tone smooth but laced. With arrogance, "Kid, do you even know who I am? People like you don't belong here. Go find a shelter." Daniel's eyes widened, not at the rejection, he had grown used to rejection, but at the way Richard laughed, the way it echoed through the car as though his hunger was a punchline. The boy's lips trembled, and he whispered back, barely audible, "I wasn't asking for money. I just wanted food." The traffic light remained stubbornly red, forcing Richard to stay in that moment longer than he wanted. Around them, a couple crossing the street caught the exchange and slowed their pace. A man walking his dog paused, staring at the limousine with a frown. For the first time that night, Richard felt a flicker of discomfort, not because of the boy, but because the boy's presence was pulling the eyes of strangers onto him, breaking the invisible barrier he had built between his world and theirs. The rain intensified, tapping against the roof of the car. Inside, one of Richard's colleagues shifted. uncomfortably, murmuring, "Maybe we should just give him something, Rich. It's just food." But Richard waved him off with a smirk, eager to maintain the image of untouchable control. Still, the boy's gaze lingered in his mind longer than expected. There was something unsettling there, an innocence that refused to break, a plea that wasn't about money or gain but survival itself. Daniel stepped back as the light turned green, his reflection swallowed by the darkness of the window. The limousine accelerated, but Richard's laughter faded quickly, replaced by a silence that settled heavily inside the car. He leaned back, swirling the last of his champagne, yet the boy's words clung to him like the rain outside. "I just wanted food." It was a sentence that pierced through layers of pride, one he couldn't easily dismiss. Cities like New York thrive on contrasts. A single block can hold both a five-star restaurant and a homeless shelter, a penthouse worth millions and a room where 5 children share a mattress. Richard knew this, but he had trained himself to see it as background noise, details irrelevant to his journey of success. That night, though, it became impossible to ignore. The truth had been pressed against his own window, forcing him to face the impact of choices he didn't even consider choices anymore. The decision to look away, the mindset of superiority, the hidden truth behind every laugh he used to cover discomfort. The story wasn't just about a poor child, standing in the rain, or a wealthy man behind a glass barrier. It was about the collision of two worlds, about the revelations that come when arrogance is exposed, and about how a single encounter has the power to transform not just one night, but an entire life. Richard Whitman didn't just live in New York, he treated it like a private showroom for his victories. His penthouse perched above Central Park like a glass crown, a place where the city looked small and tame from 40 floors up. Each morning, a driver brought the silver Maybach around the circular driveway, and Richard glided into the back seat with the same deliberate ease he used to sign contracts and dismiss people. The car was an extension of him, quiet, powerful, sealed. His tailored suits, charcoal, midnight blue, occasionally ivory, were cut so precisely they turned his posture into a statement. Even the way he adjusted his cufflinks said something. That time belonged to him, that obstacles were for other people. When the elevator doors opened into his office on Madison, assistants straightened like chess pieces. He was the king who believed every move on the board was ultimately his to command. He measured life in deals closed, goals achieved, numbers stacked in neat columns that always ended in triumph. In the conference room, he spoke about strategy like a general talks about war. "We didn't win by luck," he would say, voice steady, smile minimal but practiced. "We won because we made the right decisions. Before everyone else even knew there was a game." His colleagues admired him because admiration was the price of admission. He rewarded loyalty, he punished hesitation, and he cultivated an image of certainty so complete that even doubt seemed afraid to stand in the same room. If someone questioned his methods, he quoted performance. If someone raised ethics, he quoted results. Money was not just a resource to Richard, it was proof. Proof that his worldview worked, that his mindset was a kind of armor, that compassion was decorative at best. He liked the small rituals of dominance, never waiting for a table, never carrying a bag, never apologizing. At restaurants in Midtown, maitre d's used his first name, and he liked when they did. He liked the howl of the espresso machine at 7 a.m., the way the barista didn't ask for his order, the way a private banker's voice grew softer when he walked into a room. "I've earned this," he would tell himself. "This is what you get when you never blink." His social media account showed curated fragments of a behind-the-scenes life, rooftop dinners, helicopter shots over the Hamptons, a cigar glowing like an ember of his success. He didn't post quotes about kindness. He posted numbers and views. The message was simple. This is the impact of discipline. This is the journey of a winner. These are the rewards of a man who understood the hidden truth. You don't ask for respect, you bill for it. He had a rule about people who asked for help on The street. He called it tough love, though there was nothing loving about it. "If I give once, I invite chaos," he said more than once in the back seat, staring out at a city he believed he had outsmarted. "It's a signal, and I don't send the wrong signals." In boardrooms, he winced at the word charity, preferring strategic philanthropy, which was charity with a networking plan attached. If generosity didn't produce a measurable return, it felt inefficient. If a choice didn't move him forward, it was a distraction. His mindset simplified the world into columns: assets and liabilities, players and spectators, sharks and minnows. In that arithmetic, a hungry child on the sidewalk was not a story. He was noise. Yet, like a hairline crack in tempered glass, something could fracture even the strongest surface under the right pressure. That night on Fifth Avenue, the pressure arrived as a small, steady gaze. Richard had laughed because laughter was the fastest way to keep the wall intact. "Kid, are you kidding me?" he had said, lips curling into the confident smirk that closed 1,000 negotiations. "There are shelters. There are programs. Go find one." He didn't say it to be helpful. He said it to restore order, to place the moment neatly back into the column where he controlled the narrative. His colleagues shifted, unsure whether to laugh louder or go quiet. He gave them the answer with a look. "We are above this." The truth was that Richard's belief system had never been tested at close range. From the height of his penthouse, suffering looked like statistics. From the hush of his car, pain looked like weather. He was comfortable discussing poverty as a macroeconomic concept, as long as it remained safely theoretical. But Daniel's presence broke the fourth wall. The boy's voice didn't accuse him. It didn't demand retribution. It didn't even ask for a future. "Just food," the boy had said. 2 words that contained the most stripped-down version of human need. And if Richard could have turned away cleanly, he would have. But turning away isn't as simple once a need has touched your glass. Back at the office, the evening dragged like a stubborn shadow. His assistant brought a file. He stared at the numbers, saw none of them. He tried to isolate the moment, reduce it to a formula: discomfort plus spectacle equals momentary annoyance. Yet it kept slipping out of the equation. The more he pushed it back, the louder it returned. A memory he hadn't requested bubbled up uninvited. The one summer his father lost a job, the week of canned soup, the time his mother pretended she wasn't hungry. He had packed those memories into an attic of the mind and bricked over the door with success. But memories don't die. They wait. And when Daniel's hand touched the window, a thin draft slipped under that sealed door. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city flowing beneath him, a river of headlights and ambition. A colleague knocked and stepped in. "You good, Rich?" Richard nodded, the reflex of a man who built a career on the performance of stability. "Fine, just recalibrating." The colleague cleared his throat, hesitant. "About that kid, maybe it would have been easier to—" Richard cut him off with a glance. "I don't do guilt purchases." The colleague retreated, but the sentence rang hollow in the room, a line from a script that suddenly felt dated. There was a particular watch Richard wore when he wanted to remind himself who he was. Heavy, rare, the kind of timepiece that made other men look twice. He clasped it now, feeling the weight, as though the metal could anchor him back to certainty. He told himself the same story he always told, that the world respects the decisive, that soft hearts invite hard outcomes, that his decisions were the reason hundreds of employees got paychecks every 2 weeks. He repeated the mantras of winners: discipline, focus, velocity, until they almost drowned out the quieter voice asking whether a single sandwich would have broken the empire. He checked his calendar and booked a late dinner at a private club in Tribeca, the one with the velvet booths and the unlisted number. He liked that the host greeted him like family, liked the way doors opened before he reached them. "Mr. Whitman, tables ready." He slid into the booth, ordered the dry-aged steak, nodded through small talk about IPOs and a rival fund's misstep. From the corner of his eye, he caught the TV over the bar, muted. Captions rolling across footage of a community kitchen serving long lines of families. He speared a piece of steak and felt an unreasonable flicker of irritation at the timing. Was the whole city conspiring to break the clean lines of his narrative? "Richard," one of his guests asked, "how do you stay so unfazed?" He smiled. "Posture perfect. Simple lens," he said. "Some people let emotions run the meeting. I let outcomes run it." The table laughed appreciatively, but the answer tasted flat too. Him, like coffee left too long on a warm plate. The behind-the-scenes truth was less cinematic. Outcomes hadn't visited him tonight. A pair of eyes had. They weren't a challenge to his empire, yet they were an offense to his certainty, and certainty was the currency he valued above all. Later, he walked out into the crisp air, the city glittering like a promise that never expired. The driver opened the door. Richard paused. A hesitation so brief no one noticed, then slid into the familiar. Cocoon. The route home ran past the bakery where Daniel had paused earlier. The vent still breathed the smell of warm bread into the night. For reasons he wouldn't admit, he told the driver to slow down. He scanned the sidewalk automatically, almost annoyed at himself for looking. The boy wasn't there. The absence shouldn't have mattered, but it created a strange vacancy inside him, like a chair pulled out from a table at the last second. He rested his head against the leather and closed his eyes, trying to name the feeling. It wasn't guilt. He'd trained himself past guilt. It wasn't fear. What could threaten him here? It was something thinner and sharper, a thread tugging at a seam he hadn't realized was loose. He thought of the word transformation and scoffed at it, as if transformations were for people who could afford detours. He thought of mindset and told himself his was fine, optimized, efficient. But when he opened his eyes, the city outside looked altered by a degree no one else would measure. The hidden truth of the night was simple and inconvenient. A boy had asked for food, and the man who could buy any table on any street had chosen a laugh. What happened next didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It unfolded with the quiet persistence of a revelation, the kind that rearranges what a man believes about winning, about worth, and about the impact of a single human voice pressed against the glass of his most protected beliefs. Daniel Carter had grown used to the city, treating him like a shadow. People passed by, their coats brushing his shoulders, their phones glowing in their hands, their eyes fixed anywhere but on him. He was 11, though his frame made him look younger, thinner, as if time itself had refused to feed him. His hoodie sagged heavy with rain, its fabric stretched and frayed, and his sneakers had holes at the toes, exposing skin to the cold. Yet, even in his hunger, even in the way his ribs pressed faintly through his shirt, there was something strikingly gentle about him, something unbroken. His eyes, wide, timid, always searching, held a light that refused to die out, a light that seemed to say, maybe tomorrow will be different. He carried with him one possession, always tucked carefully into his pocket, a worn photograph of his mother, smiling in a way only mothers can, tired but radiant, holding him as a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. The corners of the picture were bent, its surface scratched from too many times being pulled out, touched, returned. It was more than a photo, it was a compass, a quiet reminder of who he was before hunger became his constant companion. Whenever the city's indifference grew too loud, whenever his stomach ached too sharply, Daniel would slip the picture out and whisper, "I'm still yours, Mom. I'll be okay." That night, the rain made his journey heavier. Each step splashed against puddles, water seeping into the soles of his shoes, chilling his feet. He pressed his arms tight across his stomach, as if squeezing could trick his body into feeling full. The smell of food taunted him at every corner, hot dogs steaming from a cart, the sharp spice of tacos wafting from a food truck, the sweet burn of roasted nuts from a street vendor. But hunger does something strange to hope. It doesn't destroy it outright. It sharpens it, forces the imagination to work harder. Daniel didn't dream of banquets or fancy meals. He dreamed of one sandwich, one piece of bread layered with cheese, or Maybe just peanut butter. Something small, simple, enough to stop the gnawing ache for a few hours. "Excuse me, sir. Do you have anything to eat?" He tried once, his voice barely audible. A businessman in a grey suit brushed past him without slowing down. Daniel lowered his eyes, cheeks burning, as though he had asked for something shameful. He kept walking, whispering encouragement to himself. "Don't give up. Someone will listen." The city kept roaring, the lights kept glowing, but his determination carried him forward. He passed a diner with tall windows where families gathered in booths, kids pressing straws into milkshakes, parents slicing pancakes. For a moment he stopped and watched, the warmth inside hitting him like a wave. A little boy about his age laughed at something his dad said, and Daniel smiled despite himself, imagining what it might feel like to sit at that booth, to have someone slide a plate across the table just for him. He didn't envy. He longed. Longing is softer than envy. It doesn't resent others for having what you lack. It simply aches for a taste of the same. There was kindness in Daniel, even when kindness wasn't shown to him. Earlier that week, he had found a quarter near the subway stairs. His first instinct was to run to the nearest store for a pack of crackers. But when he spotted another boy, younger, sitting with his knees drawn to his chest and no shoes on his feet, Daniel pressed the coin into his hand without a word. The boy's startled thank you stayed with him longer than the hunger that followed. Daniel didn't think of it as sacrifice. It was instinct. His mother had always said, "What you give, you keep. What you hoard, you lose." That's why, even as his body weakened, his spirit carried something unusual, a quiet resilience, almost defiant in its simplicity. He was not bitter, though he had every right to be. He was not hardened, though life had handed him little softness. His innocence was not naivete, it was survival, the refusal to let the world steal the last good piece of him. When he finally pressed his hand to the limousine window, it wasn't out of entitlement. He didn't see a man in a suit and think of taking from him. He saw a chance, a sliver of hope, that maybe someone could bridge the gap between his hunger and a piece of bread. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Please, food, just food." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't rehearsed. It was the simplest, rawest form of truth a human being could offer. For Richard inside the car, it looked like interruption, intrusion. For Daniel outside, it was survival. That's the hidden truth of contrasts like this. One person's inconvenience is another person's lifeline. His timid eyes searched Richard's face, not for pity, but for recognition, for the possibility that even in a world divided by wealth and circumstance, someone might still see him, not as noise, but as a boy. The rain streaked down the glass, blurring the line between them, as if the city itself wanted to remind them both how thin the divide really was. Daniel didn't know that the man behind the glass was laughing at him, mocking the purity of his request. He only knew that he had asked with hope, and that hope was the last currency he had left. The contrast between Daniel's innocence and Richard's arrogance reveals more than just a moment in the rain. It uncovers the mindset that drives people to see vulnerability as weakness and the unexpected impact when that belief is finally challenged. The light held red long enough to make the moment feel deliberate, as if the city itself had decided to force two separate worlds to look at each other. Daniel's palm flattened against the limousine window, the rain making his fingers slip a little, the cold glass shocking against his skin. He leaned close, voice careful, almost apologetic, because hunger had taught him to ask softly, "Sir, do you have anything to eat? A sandwich, maybe? Just something small." His words fogged the window and disappeared like breath pressed into a winter morning. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a future. He asked for a single decision in the present tense. One bite, one moment of mercy. Inside, Richard glanced up from his phone with the reflex of someone interrupted mid-appointment. His eyes took in the boy, calculated the scene, and he smiled. Not the warm smile of recognition, but the cool smirk that closed doors. He lowered the window 2 inches, enough to let sound out, but not dignity in. "A sandwich?" he repeated, as if testing the word for irony. "Kid, there are restaurants all over this block. That's how the world works. You pay, you eat." His colleagues chuckled, reassured by the tone. Power had a way of turning even small cruelties into entertainment. Daniel's voice stayed steady, though the effort trembled at the edges. "I don't have money," he said, eyes lifted but not defiant. "I'm not asking for cash, just food." The sentence landed like a small stone in a large room, too simple to argue with, too human to ignore. He swallowed, then tried again, softer. "Please, anything." Richard let out a short laugh, the kind that sharpens a room into categories, the amused and the humiliated. "And if I give you something," he asked, "what happens next?" "A line forms. We turn my car into a charity booth." He tilted his head toward the curb. "There are shelters for this. Systems. Go use the systems." The rain ticked against the door like a metronome, keeping time with the performance of superiority. "I don't want trouble. I'm just hungry," Daniel whispered. His hand slipped from the glass and hovered awkwardly in the air, then fell to his side. "A piece of bread is enough." "Bread," Richard repeated, amused by the plainness of the request. "Let me give you a tip, kid. The world doesn't hand out bread. It hands out bills. People like me pay them." He nodded toward the crosswalk where a couple had slowed to watch. "You're stopping traffic. Move along." He said it with a practiced ease, a mindset honed by years of decisions that always returned profit. He wasn't cruel in his own understanding. He was efficient. Efficiency to him was a moral stance. A horn sounded behind the limousine, impatient, but the light stayed red. The driver shifted. One of Richard's colleagues, less certain than the rest, cleared his throat. "Maybe we could—" Richard cut him off with a glance that meant, "Maintain the line." Then, smiling again, he returned to the boy. "You're asking the wrong person," he said smoothly. "Ask the city, ask the government, ask somebody whose job it is to care." The implication was clear. Compassion, like any service, had a department. He didn't work in it. There was a scene behind the scenes of this exchange that no one could see yet, a hidden truth threading itself through the rain. Daniel carried the ache of 1,000 small hungers that had taught him humility instead of rage. He wasn't performing poverty. He was living it, one decision at a time. Where to stand so as not to be in the way, what words to choose so strangers wouldn't feel trapped, how to hold a gaze long enough to be human, but not long enough to be a threat. He looked into the car once more, and with the last of his courage said, "I'll take whatever you don't want. Even crusts." The words were bare, and in their bareness, indicting. Richard felt the sentence like a draft he refused to acknowledge. "I want it all," he said lightly, tapping his watch to signal the end of the moment. "That's why it's mine." He turned to his colleagues, the smirk widening into a laugh that made the interior glow with complicity. "Laughter can be a knife when it's used to draw a line. You on this side, me on that one." Outside, Daniel's shoulders rounded against the rain, but he didn't run. He remained for the span of another heartbeat, giving the man inside the car one last chance to make a different decision. A woman with an umbrella paused a few feet away, frowning. "Hey," she said toward the open window, not shouting, not performing, just registering what was happening. "He's a kid." Her voice wasn't angry yet. It was disappointed, which can be more powerful. A man walking his dog slowed, eyes moving from the boy to the millionaire, as if recalibrating the city's math in his mind. The world around them didn't stop, but it shifted slightly, the way a room shifts when someone tells a truth that can't be unheard. Richard noticed the attention and felt the first stir of annoyance, not guilt, annoyance. He didn't enjoy having strangers audit his boundaries. "Listen," he said, addressing the boy, but aiming the words at the small audience gathering across the street. "Every journey has rules. Mine got me here." He nodded at the Maybach, the bespoke suit, the certainty. "Yours will take you wherever you're willing to go. Choices have impact. That's the game." He used the language he trusted, mindset, choices, outcomes. It had built an empire. Tonight, it built a wall. Daniel's lips parted, and for a second he seemed to balance on the edge of shame and resolve. "My mom says what you give, you keep," he murmured, almost to himself. "She says it comes back." The line wasn't a rebuke. It was a memory, a soft footprint left in a cold street. He reached into his pocket and touched the worn photograph without taking it out. The gesture as quiet as a prayer he didn't want anyone to see. The light turned green. The driver glanced at the mirror for permission. Richard waved his hand, and the window hummed upward, the glass reclaiming its role as a barrier. The limousine eased forward, and the boy's face, wet with rain, slid from view. The laughter inside the car faded in the next breath, because laughter needs an audience, and the audience had dissolved into movement. A second later, the woman with the umbrella was already crossing the street. The man with the dog was pulling at the leash. Taxis were filling the lane. Life was resuming the shape it always takes after a small violence passes as etiquette, but the shape inside the car changed. Silence at first. Then the routine repair. Someone made a joke about markets, another about the rival fund, the ordinary script reasserting itself. Richard stared through his own reflection in the glass, watching the city stream by as if it were a film he'd seen 1,000 times. "It's not my job," he said under his breath, an ideologue soothing himself with doctrine. "I don't do random." The doctrine worked for a block. Then the bakery appeared, the one whose vent exhaled fresh bread like a promise. In the back of his mind, a stray thought resisted translation into rational terms. He fought it off with numbers usually won. But the behind-the-scenes reel kept playing. The boy's voice, the request that cost nothing and everything, the line, even crusts. It replayed with the stubbornness of a memory that refuses to be filed. He told himself the moment had no meaning, that it was incidental, that his decisions were insulated from sentiment. He did what he always did, reached for language that had always restored order. Winners focus on leverage. Emotions are bad data. Discipline builds outcomes. He tried to graft those slogans onto the image of a small, wet hand on the glass, and this time the graft didn't take. There's a revelation that arrives slowly when a belief system meets a fact it can't metabolize. Sometimes it sounds like a sentence you can't stop hearing. Sometimes it feels like an object you can't put down even when your hands are empty. Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but the hidden truth was simple. He could have done something so small it would have cost him nothing and changed the boy's night completely. That was the impact he refused to see, not the public spectacle, not the optics, not the slippery slope argument, just the human arithmetic of one hungry child and one man who could end the hunger with a word. He pulled out his phone and opened an email he'd been avoiding, anything to redirect the journey of his thoughts back to safer roads. The numbers blurred. The phone returned to his pocket. He stared at his reflection again and saw the confident smirk from minutes earlier, now looking like a mask that had been worn too long. And then a siren flared somewhere behind them, that high New York keening that ties urgency to distance. The driver checked the mirror. The colleagues turned. Richard stayed still. He couldn't know yet what the siren meant, whether it belonged to the city's routine soundtrack or the next page of his own story. But his body responded as if summoned, an involuntary alert, a small tightening at the base of the neck that happens when decisions taken for granted begin to invite consequences. He imagined for a second the boy stepping wrong into traffic, imagined nothing more than the quick spasm of fear and the fast, cruel clarity it brings. He shook it off. "Drive," he said, the word too sharp. The Maybach picked up speed. The rain softened. The city let them pass. Yet the air inside the car had a different weight now, as if someone had opened a window inside a closed mind, and the draft refused to be ignored. No one spoke. The driver turned left. The bakery's glow disappeared. Richard pressed 2 fingers to his temple and closed his eyes. "He'll find a shelter," he told himself, and the sentence sounded like a question when it left his mouth. He didn't repeat it. The first clash between cruelty and desperation didn't end at the curb. Its echoes kept unfolding, through the decisions that followed, the revelations that waited just out of sight, and the way a single request for bread began to challenge the entire architecture of a man's certainty. The Maybach had barely cleared the next intersection when the siren that had skimmed the edge of Richard's awareness swung closer, the sound ricocheting between glass towers like a warning trying to find its target. The driver slowed on instinct, and in the mirror Richard caught a flash of motion at the curb they'd just passed. The small shape of a child folding in on itself, knees buckling as if the ground had been pulled a few inches lower without telling him. "Stop!" Richard said before he could think, the word leaving his mouth with a sharpness that surprised even him. The car eased to the side, and in the wash of the streetlight, they saw Daniel crumpled against the wet concrete. One hand still curled, as if it had been holding a hope that suddenly slipped free. The crowd reacted in ripples. A woman with the red umbrella gasped and ran back, her bag thudding against her hip. "Hey, sweetheart!" she called, kneeling so fast her knees splashed. A college kid jogging in a hoodie skidded to a stop, threw off his backpack, and dropped beside her. The man with the dog tied the leash to a hydrant and stepped into the street, palm raised to hold a taxi at bay. Others gathered, faces tilted with that mix of alarm and disbelief that always attends a collapse. How quickly a body can go from vertical to horizontal, how thin the line is between moving and not. Richard opened the door. Rain slipped into the car like a reprimand. "Sir?" one of his colleagues said, half rising, unsure whether to follow. Richard didn't answer. He stepped out, the soles of his shoes finding the glossy grip of the pavement, and for the first time that night he was on the same side of the glass as Daniel. The boy was breathing, shallow and quick. His eyelids fluttered, then stilled. The woman looked up at Richard with a stare so clean it didn't need words. It said, "You were here for the first act. Don't pretend you didn't see it." He swallowed and tried to summon the old script. It didn't load. "I need water," the woman said, turning to anyone and everyone. "Does someone have water?" The jogger shook his head, already shrugging out of his hoodie to fold it into a makeshift pillow. "I got him," he said softly. "Hey, buddy, you with us?" He touched Daniel's shoulder the way you touch a bird that's fallen from a branch. The boy's lips moved. Nothing came out. Another siren screamed closer, then cut off as an ambulance nosed through the traffic and parked at an angle that bent the flow of cars, like a river hitting a rock. The EMTs moved with the calm speed of people whose job is to outrun irreversibility. One kneeled at Daniel's side, fingers to the child's neck. "Pulse is thready," she said. "Hypoglycemic dehydration." Her partner tore an antiseptic packet with his teeth, prepping an IV, while the woman with the umbrella hovered, trying not to hover, whispering, "You're okay, baby, you're okay." The man with the dog stood guard like a sentry, shoulders squared toward the widening ring of onlookers. It wasn't a mob yet, but it had a temperature. Someone recognized Richard. It happens in New York the way thunder follows heat, inevitable and charged. A man in a suit pointed, whispering to his friend, then louder to no one in particular. "That's Whitman," he was laughing. A murmur rippled across the curb. The millionaire and the starving boy, the artifact and the aftermath. Phones appeared, angles found, faces framed. A woman lifted her screen and caught the slick black of the limousine idling a car length away, her mouth pressed flat. She didn't need to say anything for disgust to register. It sat plainly between her eyebrows, a verdict written without ink. Richard felt the crowd's temperature rise and resisted the old reflex to lecture it cooler. He stood still because movement felt dishonest. Daniel's fingers twitched against the concrete, and something small slid out of his hoodie pocket and landed face down in the water. Paper, not a phone, not a receipt. The jogger reached and flipped it over with a fingertip, careful not to tear it. A photograph, bent at the corners, splotched by rain. He lifted it toward the EMT to keep it dry and accidentally tilted it toward Richard, a woman holding a baby, tired and radiant, smiling like she knew something the world didn't. The baby was swaddled in a hospital blanket, the corner marked with a faded stamp, St. Luke's, Roosevelt. Richard felt the name strike like a remembered chord. St. Luke's, his mother's late-night shifts when he was 9, the smell of coffee on her scrubs, the refrigerator notes that always started with, "Be good, I'll be home by morning." The same hospital, the same city, the same exhausted kindness that built the floor under his own first steps. He stared at the photograph, and the memory cracked a door he had nailed shut. A phrase slipped through with it. Not elegant, not profitable, just human. What you give, you keep. He'd heard his mother say it more times than he'd counted, a wisdom that had embarrassed him when he discovered leverage. "I know that face," he murmured, shocking himself by saying it aloud. One of his colleagues, hovering behind him, misread the sentence entirely. "Press can't tie you to this," the colleague whispered. "We should go." Richard didn't respond, because the suggestion fell into a part of him that was suddenly busy with something else. Something like recognition, not of a person, but of a principle he had sidelined in favor of outcomes. The EMT slid the IV into Daniel's arm with practiced grace. The boy flinched and his eyelids fluttered. "Hey," the EMT said gently, leaning in close. "You're okay. I got you." Daniel's lips parted, voice cracked and paper thin. "I'm fine," he said, the syllables barely there. "Just hungry." The word did more damage than any accusation could have. Hungry. Not dramatic, not theatrical, not manipulative. The smallest truth. The man who could buy a private chef for a month with a single signature had laughed at a body running on empty. The hidden truth wasn't complicated. It was arithmetic you could do on your fingers. The ambulance doors yawned open. "We're taking him," the EMT said, to no one and everyone. "Mount Sinai West. He needs a glucose push and evaluation." She glanced at Richard without recognition, then away, already working the next step, because that's what real emergencies do. They prioritize function over status. The woman with the umbrella stood and addressed the space where Richard happened to be. "He asked for bread," she said, voice steady, soaked hair stuck to her cheek. "You laughed." The sentence hung there like a loaded photograph, complete on its own. Richard didn't argue, because something in him was tired of arguing with facts. He looked at Daniel, at the photograph now tucked back inside the hoodie by the jogger's careful hands, at the thin IV line arcing gently under the ambulance light. He felt a weight in his chest that didn't have a financial equivalent. He stepped closer. "Let me cover his care," he heard himself say, the words surprising him by how small they sounded next to the sound of a siren powering up again. The EMT didn't look up. "If you want to help," she said evenly, "bring something to eat when he's stable enough for solids. Don't overthink it." She slid the gurney forward, and the wheels clicked over a seam in the pavement. Daniel's eyes fluttered open once, finding light and rain and faces. For a second they landed on Richard. The boy didn't glare. He didn't plead. He looked puzzled, as if trying to reconcile a face with an action that didn't match it. Then his eyes closed again. The crowd began to dissolve, as all crowds do once the active part of the drama transfers to a place with walls and fluorescent lights. Some shook their heads at Richard as they left, not with theatrical disdain, but with the simpler disappointment of people who expected nothing and got less. The woman with the umbrella gave him a last look that was almost a question. "What did you think power was for?" She didn't wait for an answer. She folded the umbrella down to a point and walked away, shoes clicking. Richard stood in the rain until the ambulance turned the corner and the sound faded into the circuitry of the city. His colleague hovered at his shoulder, the old world trying to boot up. "We should," he began. "No," Richard said quietly. "Wait." The driver, long trained to read the temperature of a moment, said nothing. The Maybach idled, a polished animal ready to carry him back to altitude. Instead, Richard took 2 steps toward the bakery vent, where the smell of warm bread kept breathing into the night as if mocking his earlier logic. He pushed open the door. The bell chimed. Inside, the air was a soft, edible heat. A woman behind the counter looked up, caught between impatience and curiosity. Another late-night order from someone who didn't look like he needed anything quickly. "Bagels, rolls, we close in 10, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Richard's mouth opened and closed once. "Everything," he said, then heard how ridiculous that sounded. He recalibrated. 2 bags of whatever's fresh. "Sandwiches if you can make them fast." She arched an eyebrow. "Feeding a bus," he exhaled. "I don't know what I'm feeding." Honesty felt new on his tongue. While she wrapped the bread and sliced meat, he stood near the register, absorbing the quiet choreography behind the scenes. Hands moving in practiced arcs, bread becoming meals with the simple decisions of people who do it 10 times an hour. He thought about decisions again, the kind he admired in conference rooms. Decisive, clean, public. Here, a different scale of decision was at work, smaller and more precise, invisible from a distance, enormous up close. The impact wasn't a headline, it was a body warming from the inside. He left with 2 heavy paper bags and a third filled with bottled water, the handles biting into his fingers in a strangely satisfying way. In the car, his colleague finally found a question that didn't sound like PR triage. "Why do this now?" Richard stared at the bags, the smell filling the sealed cabin. "Because I can," he said. It wasn't profound, but it was truer than his usual answers. He pulled out his phone and asked the driver for the hospital. The driver named it without being told. "Mount Sinai West, sir." Richard nodded. "Go." As they moved through traffic, he glanced out at the city that had always mirrored back his certainty. Tonight, it mirrored something else. The possibility that the journey he'd celebrated was missing a lane he'd never considered entering. He didn't know what. Waited at the hospital. Paperwork, pushback, a boy who might be too proud to take what he brought. He didn't know why a simple sentence from a child had threaded itself through his expensive arguments and refused to be cut. He only knew that a door had opened a fraction, and he was tired of pretending he didn't see the light. They pulled up to the sliding glass doors. Inside, the fluorescent brightness flattened everything into essentials. Richard stepped out with the bags, feeling their weight. Again, the small gravity of bread. A volunteer at the desk looked at him, then at the bags, then back at him with a curiosity that wasn't deference. "Family?" she asked. "No," he said, then corrected himself without knowing why. "Not yet." She pointed toward the elevators. "Pediatrics, 3rd floor. If he's still in intake, they'll page you." He thanked her and walked. The sound of his own footsteps suddenly loud in a place where people measure time in heartbeats and test results. The turning point wasn't just a collapse on a wet sidewalk. It was the first fracture in a mindset, the first revelation that outcomes without humanity are a hollow currency. And what happened in those white holes would begin to show Richard the cost of the beliefs he'd worn like armor, and the unexpected ways a single boy could alter the route of a life built to never detour. Richard followed the fluorescent hallway toward pediatrics, each step of his polished shoes sounding too sharp against the linoleum. The bags of bread and water cut into his fingers, but he refused to shift them, as if their weight was part of the lesson. The hospital air carried the smell of antiseptic and warm coffee, the kind brewed in machines that never sleep. Around him, families leaned against walls, some whispering, some praying, some staring at their phones with expressions that had nothing to do with the screen. It was a world of waiting, of decisions made behind closed doors, and for the first time in years, Richard wasn't in control of the outcome. He tried to replay the evening in his head, as though he could edit it into something less damning. But the images came uninvited, like a reel he couldn't stop. Daniel's hand on the glass, the request for bread, the smirk he'd worn like armor, and the boy collapsing into rainwater while strangers rushed in to fill the void his wealth had left untouched. It pierced deeper than he expected, sharper than any market loss or failed negotiation. He had built his entire identity on the belief that he was untouchable. And yet here he was, standing in a hallway where touch itself, the human act of reaching out, was the very currency he had refused to spend. He set the bags on a chair and pressed his palms against his face, trying to steady himself. The bright light above triggered a memory he had buried so long it startled him with its clarity. He was 8 years old again, sitting in a dim kitchen in Queens, watching his mother pretend she wasn't. Hungry. The refrigerator was nearly empty, save for a carton of milk close to sour and a few slices of bread gone stale. His mother cut one slice in half, spread margarine thinly, and pushed the plate toward him. "Eat, Richie," she said with that tired smile. "I already ate at work." But he had seen her shift uncomfortably, stomach growling, eyes betraying the truth. That was the night he promised himself he would never be poor again, never be at the mercy of hunger, never let anyone hold that kind of power over him. For years, that memory had fueled him, had sharpened every decision he made. He wore his hunger like a story of survival, proof that he had earned every dollar. But standing here, the same memory replayed with new angles, new questions. If he had once been the boy staring at bread, then how could he laugh at another child for doing the same? The hidden truth cut through his pride. His empire had not erased his past. It had only hidden it behind glass and steel. He sat down, heavily, elbows on his knees, and let another memory surface. His first job at 15, washing dishes in the back of a greasy diner on Long Island. He remembered sneaking fries off plates that came back half-eaten, stuffing them in his mouth quickly before the manager could see. The taste of salt and grease, the shame of stealing what no one else wanted, the relief of having something in his stomach. He had buried that version of himself so deeply, he had forgotten the hunger that shaped him. Now it returned with full force, brought back by a boy who could have been him. One of the nurses passed by, carrying a clipboard, and Richard's eyes followed her absent-mindedly. For a second, her face blurred into the memory of another woman, thinner, frailer, his Aunt Clara. She had died young, long before he had made money, long before he could afford to help her. He remembered visiting her once in a cramped apartment where the heat didn't work, where the pantry held only canned beans and instant coffee. She had hugged him tightly, whispering, "Don't end up like me, Richie. Promise me you won't." He had promised, and he had delivered. But in delivering, had he cut off the part of himself that remembered why promises mattered? He rubbed his temple, the old mantras of success echoing weakly in his mind. Discipline, outcomes, control. But they no longer landed with the same confidence. Tonight had broken something. He felt the crack in his armor, and through it, an old vulnerability leaked back in. "Why did I laugh?" he muttered under his breath. "What did I prove?" The words were not meant for anyone else, but hearing them aloud unsettled him further. A janitor mopped near the vending machines, humming softly to himself. Richard watched him, realizing how foreign such simple labor had become to him, and yet how familiar it once was. He had worked odd jobs all through high school, scraping dollars together for bus fare and groceries. He had once carried the same weariness in his shoulders, the same quiet resignation. He wasn't born above. He had climbed step by step, but in the climb he had forgotten the ground he started from. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and for a fleeting second he pictured Daniel in his own shoes, as a boy. What would the child have become if the roles were reversed? Could Daniel grow into someone like him, hardened by survival, laughing at another boy's hunger one day? The thought chilled him, not because it seemed impossible, but because it seemed inevitable. Unless something changed, unless someone stepped in. Richard opened his eyes and stared at the bags of bread beside him. Simple, ordinary bread. Not the kind served on silver platters in his penthouse, not the kind paired with imported wine. Just food, the thing his mother had once rationed, the thing his aunt had once lacked, the thing Daniel had asked for with more courage than he himself had ever shown at that age. The weight in his chest deepened, a mixture of shame and clarity. He realized then that his entire journey had been built on a paradox. He had run from hunger so fiercely that he convinced himself compassion was weakness. Yet compassion was the very thing that might have saved him from becoming the man who laughed at a starving child. The transformation wasn't complete, but the first crack had widened. He wasn't proud of it, but he couldn't deny it either. In the distance, an intercom called out a code, the kind that makes nurses rush and families hold their breath. Richard stood and paced, unable to sit still, his reflection chasing him in the glass windows. He looked at himself and saw both versions at once, the boy in Queens eating half a slice of bread, and the millionaire who sneered at another boy's plea. The contradiction gnawed at him, louder than any applause he had ever earned. Reflection alone was not enough. What mattered was the decision that would follow, the choice between staying imprisoned by arrogance or allowing the cracks in his pride to grow into something resembling change. And as the night unfolded, the revelations waiting for Richard would test not just his wealth, but the very core of who he believed himself to be. Richard stood at the threshold of the pediatric ward, his body frozen, as if the polished floors had turned to ice beneath him. The nurse had pointed toward a small room, its door half open, where Daniel now lay on a bed that looked too big for his fragile frame. Machines beeped softly, IV fluids dripping into his arm, his face pale but calmer than it had been on the street. Richard hesitated, the bags of bread still in his grip, his knuckles white around the handles. For years he had walked into boardrooms without flinching, stood before investors with unshakable poise. But stepping through that doorway felt like crossing into a battlefield where his usual weapons, money, confidence, power, were useless. He finally pushed the door with his shoulder and stepped inside. The room was dim, lit by the glow of monitors and the muted yellow of a wall lamp. A chair sat beside the bed, where the woman with the red umbrella had taken her place like a silent guardian. She glanced up at Richard, her expression unreadable, then rose without a word and slipped quietly out into the hallway, leaving him alone with the boy he had once dismissed as noise. Richard set the bags down on the chair and moved closer. Daniel stirred, his eyelids twitching before opening halfway. His eyes were glassy but focused, searching the room until they landed on Richard. There was no fear there, no anger, only confusion, as though the boy was trying to reconcile the man before him with the memory of the one who had laughed. Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, but the words caught, trapped in the weight of his own shame. "Hey," he finally managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "It's me, from earlier." Daniel blinked, lips parting slowly. His voice came out in a whisper, each word fragile. "I wasn't asking for money." He paused, his breathing shallow. "I just wanted bread, sir." The sentence pierced through Richard like a blade of glass, clean and merciless. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't accusatory. It was the simplest truth, delivered without malice. Bread, that was all. A request so small it made his wealth look absurd, his arrogance grotesque. Richard felt his knees weaken, and before he knew it, he was sinking down beside the bed, his expensive suit creasing. Against the sterile floor, he gripped the side of the mattress as though steadying himself against a storm. "I laughed," he whispered, the admission heavier than any confession he had ever made in his life. "I laughed when you asked me. I don't even know why. I thought I was above it, above you." His chest heaved, the words spilling faster now. "But I was wrong. God, I was so wrong." Tears pressed against the edges of his eyes, hot and unrelenting. He tried to fight them, to preserve the last fragment of the image he had built, but the dam broke. His shoulders shook as the sobs came, raw and unpracticed, the kind of crying he hadn't allowed himself since childhood. He pressed his hand to his face, but it did nothing to hide the sound, nothing to erase the cracks now spreading through the walls he had built around himself. Daniel watched quietly, his own body too weak to react with more than a flicker of surprise. For a moment, he seemed unsure of what to do with a groan. Man's tears, but his innocence filled the gap where experience might have failed. Slowly, his small hand lifted, the IV line tugging slightly as he reached. His fingers brushed Richard's wrist, tentative but steady. "Don't cry, sir," he whispered. "It's okay." Those words undid Richard completely. The boy he had mocked was comforting him, as though compassion flowed in only one direction in this room. "It's not okay," Richard choked out, shaking his head. "It's not okay that you had to beg. It's not okay that I laughed. It's not okay that I forgot what it feels like to be you." His voice cracked, the confession tearing through him with the weight of decades. "I was you once. I was hungry, and I swore I'd never be again. But somewhere along the journey, I turned that promise into arrogance. I thought climbing out meant leaving compassion behind." Daniel's eyes closed for a moment, his hand still resting lightly against Richard's arm. His voice, faint as it was, carried a wisdom that no boardroom could match. "My mom says people forget, but if you remember, you can help." He coughed softly, then added, "That's why I keep her picture, so I don't forget." Richard's gaze darted to the boy's hoodie pocket, where the photo still rested. He thought of his own mother, of the nights she skipped meals, of the promises he made in kitchens that smelled of desperation. He thought of the way he had buried those memories, treating them as fuel for ambition instead of lessons in kindness. The hidden truth was undeniable now. Forgetting hadn't freed him. It had broken him in ways he hadn't noticed until a child's request shattered the illusion. "I remember," Richard whispered, his tears still flowing. "I swear to you, Daniel, I remember now." He leaned his forehead gently against the boy's hand, not caring that his suit was damp with tears, not caring who might walk in. The moment stripped him of everything but humanity, and for the first time in years that felt like enough. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, filling the silence that followed. Richard stayed there on his knees, trembling, his pride dismantled piece by piece. The boy had asked only for bread, but what he had given Richard was far greater, a mirror, a reminder, a second chance at being human. The transformation wasn't complete, but it had begun, and Richard could feel its impact deep in his bones. Heartbreak alone doesn't rewrite a life. It takes choices, revelations, and the courage to act differently once the tears dry. And the journey Richard was about to step into would test whether his breakdown was just a moment of guilt or the start of something greater, a shift in mindset that could change not only him, but the boy whose innocence had opened the cracks in his heart. The nurse returned to the doorway and found Richard still on his knees, the bags of bread at his feet, like a witness to the most inconvenient truth. She cleared her throat softly and stepped in just far enough to keep her voice low. "He's stable," she said, glancing at the monitor. "Glucose brought him back up. We'll keep him overnight for observation." Richard stood, wiping his face with the back of his hand, trying to regain enough composure to speak without breaking again. "Thank you," he managed. "I brought food for when he can have solids." The nurse nodded toward the chair. "We'll pace it. Small portions. It's not just hunger, it's refeeding carefully. Talk to the social worker on duty. She's good." The word good landed with more weight than it should, as if competence itself were a form of grace. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights felt less hostile than before, and Richard followed the blue sign that read, "Family Services." A woman in a knit cardigan looked up from her computer with the kind of calm that comes from years of meeting people at their most fragile. Her badge read, "Allison Grant, LCSW." "Mr.?" she prompted. "Whitman," he said, then quickly added, "I'm not family. I'm responsible." The last word surprised him, but it fit. Responsible for what happened earlier and for what happens next. Allison studied him, not impressed by the name, but alert to the change in tone. "Sit," she said gently. "Tell me what you can, and tell me what you want to do." He told her quietly, without the armor of performance, about the street, about the laugh that already felt like it belonged to someone he no longer wanted to be, about the collapse, the photograph, the sentence that had cracked him open. Allison listened without interruption, the way people do when they understand that shame can dissolve if it's allowed to breathe. When he finished, she folded her hands. "He's not a case to solve," she said. "He's a child with a history. Our job is to build a plan that puts safety first and pride intact. Money helps. Consistency helps more." Richard nodded, grateful for the directness. "What does consistency look like right now?" She clicked her pen. Mind already. Mapping steps. Tonight, medical care. Tomorrow, immediate needs. Clothes, a safe bed, a nutrition plan. We'll check for next of kin. If there's no guardian, short-term shelter. The system can bruise, but there are good people in it. If you say you'll show up, you show up. That's the impact. I will show up, he said, and the sentence felt like a contract with himself. I want to cover the bills, and I want him to have food that isn't just today's fix. I want him to know there's a place that's his. Allison nodded. We can accept payment on his account. As for housing, let's move step by step. There's a reputable youth shelter in Hell's Kitchen, Harbour House. If we can get him there with a warm handoff and a guarantee he won't fall through the cracks, that's a start. He leaned forward. I'll underwrite a block of beds if it keeps him and others from the street. No plaque, just outcomes. She gave a small smile. Outcomes are welcome. So is humility. Back in the room, Daniel slept. The photograph tucked beneath his palm, as if it were a promise he couldn't risk losing. Richard set a soft roll on the tray and folded a note under it. A simple line. I brought bread when you're ready. He sat in the chair and watched the steady rise and fall of the boy's chest, and something in him eased. Not relief exactly, but a loosening of the knot he'd tied around his own heart. The transformation he feared would make him weak was making him clear. Wealth had insulated him. Compassion was oxygen. When Daniel woke near dawn, the city still dark at the edges, he squinted at the tray and then at Richard. The boy looked from the roll to the IV and then back to the man who hadn't left. Is that, he asked. For you, Richard said. When the nurse says it's time. Daniel's voice was small but steadier than before. I thought you'd go. Richard shook his head. I did, for too long. I'm here now. Daniel's gaze slid to the bags on the chair. There's a lot. A corner of Richard's mouth lifted. Turns out I've been overdoing the wrong things. Allison slipped in with a clipboard and a practical smile. Morning, Daniel. I'm Allison. I help kids figure out the next steps. No pressure now, just questions when you're ready. Daniel nodded, alert but cautious, the way children get when they've learned the world is a place you test before you trust. Can I see my picture? He asked. Richard lifted the photo, its edges still damp from last night's rain, and placed it gently in the boy's hands. I kept it safe. Daniel traced his mother's smile with one finger. She used to say mornings are second chances. Richard felt the sentence lodge in him like a stake holding a tent against wind. She was right, he said softly. Sometimes you need the sun to see the hidden truth of a night. He looked to Allison. What do we do first? We feed him, she said simply. Then we find him clothes that fit dignity, not just size. By mid-morning, small, careful bites had become a sandwich, and the sandwich had become a spark in Daniel's eyes. Richard called his driver and diverted the day's meetings without explanation. He went down to the hospital's small gift shop and bought a soft sweatshirt and new socks. He ordered jeans from a nearby store and had them couriered up. Not showy gestures, useful ones, behind-the-scenes decisions that signal respect. When Daniel slid his feet into the socks, he sighed, the sound of warmth returning to a body that had learned to live without it. These feel like a house, he said, wiggling his toes. Richard smiled. Then we'll work on the rest of the house. Allison returned with the first map of the journey. Here's what we can do today. Discharge when he's cleared, a ride to Harbour House, a warm handoff to the director, Ms. Patel. I'll go with you. Mr. Whitman, if you want to assist, do it by their rules. Keep the spotlight off the kid and on the plan. Understood, he said. There was a steadiness in the word that felt new. They left the hospital through a side entrance to avoid the curious phones that had multiplied since the night before. The city smelled like wet concrete and coffee. In the car, Daniel held the photo with both hands and looked out the window as if the glass itself were different now that he wasn't on the wrong side of it. Do people get mad if I stay somewhere? He asked, almost apologizing for taking up space. People get relieved, Allison said, because safe is better than lucky. Richard added, And when relief turns into routine, that's when you start to breathe. Harbour House didn't look like a rescue on the outside, just a brownstone with a neat stoop and a bell that chimed lightly when the door opened. Inside, the lobby was warm in the way that says someone thought about lamps, not just lights. Ms. Patel met them, her handshake firm, her eyes kind but unwavering. "We are structure and care," she said to Daniel. "Not perfect, not paradise, but safe and real." Daniel nodded, clutching the photo. Ms. Patel looked to Richard briefly. "We don't let donors adopt programs for the sake of their conscience. We partner if they accept our rules." He nodded, grateful for the line in the sand. "I'm here to partner. Tell me what you need, that budgets never cover." She didn't blink. Nutritious snacks that fill more than an hour. Noise-cancelling headphones for kids who can't sleep. Weekend tutoring so school can start to make sense again. And funds for emergency hotel, nights when shelters overflow. "Done," he said. No ceremony, just decisions. She gave the faintest nod. Approval deferred until deeds caught up to words. In a small office, paperwork became a path instead of a barrier. Daniel signed where he could, Alison signed where she had to, and Richard signed where money could remove friction without erasing process. A volunteer named Ben brought a tray, turkey sandwiches, apple slices, a carton of milk. Daniel ate slowly, careful now because careful had become a reflex. When he finished, he leaned back and looked at Richard with a seriousness that felt older than his years. "Are you going to forget?" Richard held his gaze. "No." Daniel's eyebrows lifted, a tiny test. "People say that," he said. "Then the next day is louder." Richard nodded, taking the lesson. "Then I'll make this louder." He stepped aside with Ms. Patel and Alison. "Set up an account I can refill, discreetly, for the things that fall between lines. And I want to meet the kids, who don't show up on lists because they're good at disappearing. I have time." Ms. Patel studied him for a beat longer, as if she were scraping the last of the gloss off his intention to see what remained. "You'll learn that showing up is not the same thing as being seen," she said. "But showing up is how you earn the chance." He accepted it as instruction, not critique. "I'll earn it." Afternoon light climbed the brownstone's interior wall, tracing the slow arc of a day that would have looked ordinary to anyone passing on the sidewalk. Inside, it felt like a hinge quietly turning. Richard made calls he had never made before, not to bankers or brokers, but to the city's food bank, to sponsor deliveries on a schedule, to a clinic that provided dental care to kids who flinched at cold water, to a community centre that needed funds for a homework room with computers that didn't freeze mid-assignment. Each call altered something in him. Small decisions, repeated. He didn't post about any of it. The only record was the relief in other people's voices. Before he left, he returned to the lobby where Daniel sat on a bench, fiddling with the drawstrings of his new sweatshirt. Richard knelt, not out of drama, but out of respect for the height of the conversation. "I can't fix everything," he said, "but I can fix some things. Tonight that means you sleep in a bed that's yours. Tomorrow we add something else. You get a say." Daniel searched his face for the trick and found no glare, no smirk, only a steadiness that felt safe enough to lean into. "Can I keep the picture on the table next to me?" "You can keep it wherever it helps you remember," Richard said. Daniel's mouth tilted into the faintest smile. "Then I think I'll be okay." Walking back to the car, Richard noticed how the city's sound had shifted for him. The same streets, the same traffic, but his mind had tuned to different frequencies. A kid laughing on a scooter, the low hum of a laundromat, the clatter of dishes. In a diner that now smelled less like indulgence and more like sustenance. The hidden truth was out in the open. Wealth had given him options, not purpose. Purpose was a decision made repeatedly in the direction of someone else's good. He felt the old suits of certainty hanging in his mental closet and knew he would never wear them the same way again. That evening, he returned to his penthouse and did something he hadn't done in years. He laid out a notebook on the kitchen counter and began writing longhand, not a plan for acquisition, but a list of names and places that had surfaced through Allison and Ms. Patel: Harbor House, Mount Sinai West, St. Luke's Roosevelt, Food Bank for New York, after-school tutors in Hell's Kitchen. Beside each, he wrote a practical next step and a person to call. It wasn't a performance. It was maintenance of a promise he was not willing to let the noise of tomorrow erase. He picked up his phone to cancel a weekend helicopter trip he no longer wanted, and replaced it with a block of hours he could give away without being seen. Before he slept, he called the hospital to check on Daniel. "He's sleeping," the nurse reported. "Vitals are good." Richard thanked her and stared out at the city from 40 floors up. From here, the streets looked like capillaries feeding a living thing. He thought about how often he'd measured success in vertical distances, in floors climbed, in numbers added. Tonight, the measure felt horizontal, like a bridge laid across a gap he had once insisted didn't exist. Redemption is not a single gesture. It's a series of deliberate choices made after the spotlight moves on, and the next steps in Richard's journey would reveal whether his mindset truly shifted or whether the old armor would try to close over the cracks that a hungry boy's courage opened. Richard sat by the window of his penthouse that night. The city lights sprawled out like a constellation made of glass and ambition. For years, those lights had been his scoreboard, each glowing tower a reminder of how far he'd climbed from the dim kitchen of his childhood. But tonight, they didn't look like trophies. They looked like people, millions of them, each carrying stories he'd never cared to see. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. The tailored suit, the sharp jawline, the unmistakable mark of wealth. Yet behind the expensive details, he finally recognized the boy he once was, the boy who had eaten stale bread in silence and promised himself a better life. He realized the hidden truth he had ignored for too long. Somewhere along the journey, he had traded compassion for pride, and all it took was a starving child's voice to remind him what he had lost. The memory of Daniel's words wouldn't leave him. "I just wanted bread, sir. I didn't want your money." They echoed not as accusation, but as revelation. Bread, the simplest request, the most human of needs. Richard had spent years chasing after outcomes measured in millions, yet he had failed to understand that the smallest gestures often carried the greatest impact. That was the paradox of his life. He had conquered boardrooms and headlines, but he had once forgotten how to see the hunger of a child as more important than the balance of a ledger. His tears earlier had startled him, not because they exposed weakness, but because they revealed something he had buried, his own humanity. Tears had not made him smaller, they had made him real. And in that moment beside Daniel's bed, he discovered something money could never purchase, the relief of remembering who he truly was. The transformation wasn't complete, but it had begun. He had tasted the freedom of a new mindset, one where generosity was not a liability but a lifeline. Sometimes it takes the smallest voice to remind us what it means to be human. Not the loud speeches, not the grand victories, but the trembling words of a boy who asked for bread and gave back a lesson larger than any. Empire, that's the impact of innocence. That's the hidden truth behind every story of contrast. It's not the powerful who save the powerless, it's often the powerless who save the powerful by reminding them of what truly matters. As you think about this story, maybe you've lived moments where you were reminded of your own humanity in unexpected ways. Maybe you've seen someone's quiet courage shake your certainty, or maybe you've felt the weight of forgetting what's essential and then being humbled back to the basics. If this message was for you, let it sit in your heart for a while. And if you want, share it below. Leave your words, your reflections, even just a simple line like, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." Those small phrases create a bridge, a community of people who understand that stories like this aren't just about millionaires and children, they're about us. And if this touched you, let it continue. There's another story waiting, one that carries The same heartbeat of compassion, the same behind-the-scenes revelations about pride, kindness, and second chances. You'll find it right here, ready to take you deeper into this journey. Because sometimes the most important transformations don't happen in silence. They happen when we choose to keep walking together through the lessons that stories uncover. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic because what lingers after the tears is not just emotion. It's the decision to carry the lesson forward, to ask ourselves how we can live differently after the story ends. And that's where the next chapter begins. And if you've stayed with me all the way here, it probably means this story spoke to something inside you. That's why I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end," or maybe, "This message was for me." It's a simple way to let me know these stories matter to you too. And if along the way you felt that connection, a quiet reminder of what really counts, a like on this video helps keep that message alive for more people. If you want to keep walking through stories that touch, challenge, and transform, subscribing is the best way to stay close. We'll keep uncovering moments like this together. And right here, there's another video waiting that ties beautifully into what we just shared. Click and continue with me there. You might find it speaks to you in ways you don't expect.